Welcome to Reconnect, the podcast dedicated to sharing and defending the good news of Jesus Christ. The word religion comes from two root words, re, again, and lig, connect. Together, religion means reconnect. The Bible reveals that it is through Jesus Christ alone that we are reconnected into a right relationship with God. Reconnect us, O Lord.
All right, welcome to episode 34 of the Reconnect podcast. This is George, and of course I'm here with Andy. For today's show, we're actually going to go back to Andy's master thesis that he did at Concordia University, Irvine, as a student in the Master of Arts International Studies program. Is that right, Andy?
Yeah, it was International Studies.
Okay. So the title of his paper was The Use of Chinese Literature as a Cultural Starting Point to Present the Gospel of Jesus Christ. And I'll just kind of start to introduce you to his paper. This is straight from his abstract. It reads, Common methods of Christian evangelism present a list of facts about man's depravity and God's act of salvation for mankind. These methods are problematic in today's mostly postmodern world that does not accept absolute truths. These methods also use terminology and concepts unknown outside of the Christian faith, furthering the difficulty of communicating the gospel. This research project then seeks to find a well-known piece of Chinese literature that Christians can use as a cultural starting point when presenting the gospel in China, eliminating the problems of a facts-based presentation of the gospel. So, Andy, can you just start by kind of walking us through like the problem that you saw, or how you were finding this to be a problem as you were preparing to go over to China? Because that was part of your master's work, right? You spent over a year in China?
Yeah, I was there in China for 3 years.
Okay.
I lived in Hangzhou, which is about an hour from Shanghai. Most people know it as Shanghai, but I guess it's properly pronounced Shanghai. They don't have a long A in Chinese. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I lived in Hangzhou for 3 years, and the program, you only had to be there for like 10 months. You had to, at the time when I was in it, you had to be an English teacher. And so mine was international studies with the education emphasis. But before going to China, what really got me there was that I had Taiwanese roommates, also had Korean roommates while at Concordia Irvine. And right off from the start, I got plugged into a English second language Bible study. It was called Friends Uniting Nations Bible Study, Fun. And so right off the bat with that, I saw that there was difficulty explaining just the Christian faith because with Japanese and Chinese in particular, they don't really know sin. This isn't really a concept. The fall, all the narratives that we are just, I think, mostly used to in America, they weren't familiar with. So there was a lot to have to unpack and explain. And it's like you get God, and then all of a sudden you get this Trinity. How does God have a son? What does that mean? So it's just like to present the basic gospel message, it would just be a ton of information, which is fine to do. But I had been reading some books and ideas before going to China that it could be easier to try to just find stories to explain the message, just to get the ideas across. So I had that in mind because we had to pick a research question while there. And the last semester at Concordia, when I was there, they would every senior had to take a class which combined two fields of study, and it was a short, like, seminar type class. And I took one which was combining psychology with literature, and the focus was the monomyth.
Okay, so this was in the undergraduate level.
Yeah, this was
before
the
you went
undergrad.
into your master's program.
Yeah. So I had just come off that class, and what I gleaned from that class was, wow, this is really cool. Every culture apparently has the same story, and our main text was Joseph Campbell's Hero of 1,000 Faces. And because it wasn't a theology class per se, they didn't say this, but as a theology major at the time, I really picked up on, wow, this hero really seems a lot like Jesus Christ. And the story which all cultures seem to have that Campbell was presenting was that the whole world has a problem. One person can save that world from the problem, and sometimes that even involved that character somehow dying and coming back from the dead, or entering into something like a belly of a well type scenario and coming out of it. But whatever dragon battle he faced, he would somehow come out of it coming back to his people with salvation, essentially. And he was the only one that could do it. And I was like, that seems a lot like Jesus to me.
Right. So you just mentioned it was Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces. Yeah. And this is kind of his seminal work.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And I haven't read the book. I've seen it. I've read it referenced in a few different places. I think George Lucas has said that it was hugely influential in what came to be Star Wars. I think I've just read it referenced in several different pop contexts of singers, songwriters, people in the movie industry find this work very influential just because it taps into these common human themes. So, is there anything else that you found interesting about that, or that was?
The print of the book we had actually had a picture of Luke Skywalker on the cover, and so that was referenced in the class. And kind of what I understood of it was Lucas saw this and said, "Well, if this is a common theme that most stories have, then maybe I can intentionally write a story to have it." Because the idea was this unconsciously came about. Right.
So Joseph Campbell, he has no Christian motive in writing this, or he's not saying this is what points to Christ or anything like this.
No,
it's
not
just
at all.
His observation.
Yeah, I think Campbell was an agnostic, probably. I don't think he had a religion. If he did, it was probably more pluralistic. There's this higher truth. We don't have access to this higher truth. But unconsciously,
you can see how all of these different cultures are all arriving at this separately.
Yeah, we unconsciously come to this understanding of this is how the world is, and this is how it should be, and this is how maybe we can get there through our mythology. And I think Lucas just tapped into it and intentionally wrote a story that would have this hero cycle in it. So like Luke, having this call to adventure, he has to leave his home planet. He goes through these various struggles and battles, and he is the one that can ultimately bring, I guess, salvation or restore order to the land. So pretty neat, I thought. And I was just curious, going to China, what stories do they have? Can I find a story that somehow could parallel the gospel narrative?
Yeah.
And if I can find that and then connect it with other stories and show them, look, the whole world's thinking this. And I think this is pointing to Christ,
right?
Just as a way to share that gospel message.
So prior to Joseph Campbell and prior to going to China, could you kind of give us a picture of your evangelism background, or how you approached evangelism, or what you thought were what were the best ways to do it, or ways that you had seen others doing it, or ways you had done it yourself that weren't working? I know you kind of started to touch on that a little bit with your roommates. And the challenges of trying to communicate it across cultures. What were some ways that, what were some of the experiences you had or lessons that you had learned?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it was through service at the same time as teaching in a way, because the people I was mostly working with were international students that wanted to speak English. They wanted American friends. They didn't really necessarily always have American friends. I see it a lot at the school I currently work at. International students kind of form their little cliques. They got their little table, which, that could just be human nature.
Sure.
We speak the same language. We eat the same foods. It's a lot easier. But it was hard, I think, for a lot of people, even if they wanted to break into that. Because it's this is a different group. They're speaking a different language. But I think inwardly, because they were here to actually study English and they were in America in a way to learn American culture, what best way to do it besides with Americans? So I think just by being with these people, it's showing them almost kind of like being their guide while they're here in a way. Hopefully just being their friend while they're here. The Bible study was called Friends Uniting Nations. So I think it was through that service, but at the same time, it was more just kind of taking advantage maybe of the fact that they wanted just an American friend and wanted to speak English. I'm well, we have this Bible study. And so they would come not really caring about the Bible portion, but just wanting to speak English and meet Americans. So it was kind of, I don't know if it was necessarily taking advantage of them in that sense, but definitely it was very effective because they did want to meet with us and they didn't really mind that it was about the Bible. And I found that a lot of them, I think, were genuinely interested in the Bible because they did see it as something that was part of American culture and that they didn't grow up with, especially in like countries like Japan, where it's like less than 1% is Christian. Yeah. It's kind of unfathomable for us, I think, to understand. In China, I think the percentage is getting a lot higher. But even then, it's still really low percentage of the population. So just maybe it was a very easy way to evangelize. And then the most of my other evangelism, I don't know, I guess it was just difficult sometimes, like speaking in that context, because it was people didn't really know as much. So it was almost like, and it was speaking of people that were just really learning the language. So sometimes it felt like maybe you were teaching kind of like kindergarten level Christianity. Right. Even though you're talking to people that are sometimes 20, 30 years old. Yeah.
Yeah, so I thought an interesting part of your paper was when you kind of contrast this approach that you were kind of going over to China with, like how you were going to try to run in this direction of using like the story as a way to get to the gospel, and you kind of contrast that with a couple of other popular ways of how like Americans go about doing evangelism. So you talk about the 4 spiritual laws that Campus Crusade really popularized, and you talk about the Romans' road to salvation as sort of a very kind of a very like strict, scripted, outlined. You know, you move from one point to the other. You have your 4 main points, or whatever. Could you kind of contrast that to the style that you were presenting, and why you thought that this would be more effective than these other types of approaches?
And again, like the paper's called Using Chinese Literature as a Starting Point. So I think you still have to get into that fact-based, like God sees us as sinners. What is sin? How did God provide a way for us to have a relationship with him despite that sin? I think you still have to get into those forms of presenting the gospel. Because that's what Scripture does. Yeah. But maybe start with a story, something they can relate with. So that was at least the idea. And something else, kind of going back to what I was saying before, like this idea of service, linked with presenting the message, is kind of sharing the message, truth and love. In China, if I just start with the facts of Christianity, it's kind of like, oh, so you're a Christian. We're not really Christian at all. They still see America as a Christian nation, even though I think living here, you can kind of see from most of what we pop out in our pop culture, it's far from Christian, at least what's being presented for the most part. And the fact that so many people are, quote, Christians, and that's what we're buying, kind of indicates we don't really care that what we're digesting isn't Christian per se, and coming from non-Christian makers. But I think for them, if we come at it, it's like, this is almost like you need to become us. You need to become American. But it's like, well, no, we're Chinese. Right. And I feel like if the idea was, if I can eat your food, learn some of your language, want to just genuinely, like, what are your holidays? And maybe you find connections through those instead of just like, this is Christmas and it points to Christ. Right. Like, it could almost be seen as, I'm here because it's almost like showing respect, that I took the time to learn your language or know your stories, which I found quite a lot when I started to share stories and things from Chinese culture. Just even knowing these stories, some people are like, oh, you know that story? Exactly. I'm like, yeah, I know that story. And like, I even really got into the town I lived in. I knew all the famous locations in the city, and it was a tourist city for the Chinese. So I knew all the locations, I knew all the stories behind them, and people that lived there were just like, wow, you seem to know my city more than I do. You could be like a tour guide here. And I'm like, yeah, it would be fun. Maybe I could do English tours just for people.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation of, I've, like in my travel experience, and not always for the sole purpose of evangelism, but just in general travel experience, when you find yourselves in kind of, places that are off the beaten path, or that aren't in like, the tourist traps. If you find yourself at just like a small local restaurant, like people, when they find out like, oh, you're not from here, yet you're here eating at like this diner that I eat. Well, that's cool. Like you didn't go to like the one place that every, travel guide tells you to go to. You went here instead. And so like it's just a natural, like the conversation just naturally flows out of that. And so I think that's a really interesting point about like when you're able to start with a common ground like that. And I think kind of what it sounds like you were seeing is that like these, things like, have you heard of the 4 spiritual laws or the Romans road to salvation? That doesn't necessarily start with a common ground, because it's starting with an assumption of like, oh, well, I know something that you don't know. And as Christians, we do want to get to that, because we believe that that's something that you don't know is good news. Yeah. But is it just immediately seen as off-putting? Or just like, okay, well, we don't share that in common, so we really can't have a conversation. Yeah. Whereas you're saying like starting with a shared story lets you get to these other questions, lets you get to the good news of the gospel. And so I think that's a really, that's an interesting observation. The other part I think you kind of go on about is like why, not only in other cultures, but like in our postmodern society, why don't these approaches work? And you kind of cite the main reason of that as many people just flat out reject absolute truths. So you coming in and saying, have you heard of the 4 spiritual laws? I mean, to a postmodern society, that's, well, okay, that's nice. Why should I believe that is true? Or why should I, that's true for you, but it's not necessarily true for me. Yeah. And so how do you see like story as kind of the way to overcome that? Right.
So again, like approaching this monomyth idea, if all stories are basically the same across cultures, if they're all telling the same stories, Joseph Campbell discovers. And I think most of the fairy tales, when you look at them, you're like, is this really just about a prince saving a princess? Or can this actually point to Jesus, the Prince of Princes, the Lord of Lords, saving his people, the church? Stepping in, is there really, is it a mythical dragon, or can this point to Satan? Even going video games, you got Mario rescuing a princess and you got Koopa. This is like an ongoing sort of like theme, and every culture seems to have these types of stories that can point to these higher realities that I as a Christian can see are found in Christ and his revealed word, Scripture. And so this idea of, with postmodernism, truth is relative. It's based on one's experiences. Truth comes from within one's culture. And since every culture is different, people just say there is no absolute truth. But if every culture in some way has elements that point to this higher story, which I as a Christian says is true and absolute, I at least entering into this culture, if I have that story as the starting point, I'm starting with their common ground, what they already accept to be authoritative for them. And so I start from that and build into Christianity. And then hopefully through that process, they start to click and see, okay, this doesn't go against my culture. This doesn't go against who I am or this doesn't go against what I accept to be true. This actually fits. So I can embrace and accept this. And then hopefully once they get there, they can start to see why that absolute truth was found even in their culture, because God has written his word, or has written his law upon people's hearts. We as people just know inwardly that there is more to life. We yearn for more. We inwardly yearn to have a life after this life. We want to go on. Why is that? Well, because God has written eternity upon our hearts. We know there is something more. It comes out in our stories. And it just so happens that our stories, that what we expect to see, actually matches what really is in Christ. And so that's kind of the concept behind the storytelling evangelism. And in America, when I talk to people, like when you and I are on campuses talking to people with contradict, I don't usually get into the stories as much. It does start with the fact-based thing. So what I'm doing now almost flies against this paper I wrote 10 years ago, but I think even in our sort of approach on campuses, starting with, hey, all religions can't be true, which is true, I still think in the conversation at some point in time, I may use stories to help fit the mold, to help express this, but it may be more a second thing instead of a first thing.
Sure. Yeah. Let's get into what that story was that you found to be, kind of the one you landed on in the work that you were doing in China. So how, in this paper you go into some great lengths of how you went about a very academic process of arriving at the right story. But could you just kind of summarize that? Like how were you looking for it, and how did you end up finding it?
Yeah, I mean, I went to Chinese bookstores, and I went to the English section, and I found what they would say would be Chinese folktales. Just thinking these are folktales. This is probably what most people would know. I read up on a lot of these, and from what I kept finding was that there were 4 main folktales. Okay. And I picked one of them that I thought would be the best because I thought it could fit into the monomyth. It was Liang, Shanbo, and Yingtai. They're called the butterfly lovers, which was great for me because this story is actually linked to the town that I was living in. So their sort of love story begins at this academy, which happened to be located in Hangzhou, China. Nice. So I even got to visit this academy, you know, and so it had a good parallel to Romeo and Juliet. And one of the books I brought with me to China was Donald Miller's Searching for God Knows What. And at the end of that book, he actually tells how the story of Romeo and Juliet points to the story of Christ and the church. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And so having that in mind at the same time, I was like, okay, this is cool. I already see how he's used this to share the gospel. And it's surprising that Liang Shangbo Yingtai is recognized even by the Chinese as the Romeo and Juliet of China.
Interesting. And
so kind of tying that into, well, you got this story in Europe arising from Shakespeare. I got a good feeling Shakespeare had no clue about this story. Right. Emerging completely different places. The Liang Shangbo Yingtai one would predate the Shakespeare one. Right. So it's kind of cool, I think, that if we can tie this together to point to Christ, it fits the monomyth, fits the story. And then from there, I just had to do research to find out, like through conducting surveys, what does this story mean to the Chinese? And do most of them know it? And if most of them know it, and if what it means to them is that this is like a story of ultimate love, this is what true love looks like, great. Your version of true love echoes what the Bible says true love is. And this so happens to be what most Westerners would go, what's the greatest love story? Well, probably Romeo and Juliet would just pop into our mind. So our greatest love story, both in the West and here in China, matches what the Bible says is God's love story to us. Yeah, interesting. So it's just kind of a powerful sort of connection.
Yeah. So how did you, what were some of the ways that you started kind of testing this out in conversation? Like who did you go to first? How did you find out like whether or not this was actually going to be a successful, or the right story to tell?
Yeah. So like, when I first found this story, but before I even began really the whole process of like, let me see if people actually know this and what do they think of it, I first presented it to a Chinese Christian group. This was an invitation that I got at one point when I first went there, like right about the week I was flying to China, a really bad typhoon hit nearby the city I was living at. And there were massive calls, like the vice president of China was like, all walks of life need to come and help. Wow. And I had just that year had gone to Mississippi to help with Hurricane Katrina. So I was like, this could be a cool, like, Christian missionary opportunity. So I found a rural area which had been hit by this typhoon, and I got there a few months too late. They said, well, everything's already taken care of by now. And I realized it was because in China, the buildings were made of concrete. At least this town, they were mostly concrete buildings. And so the roofs got lost. And the government literally just came in with the military and built the roofs. And so it wasn't as big a deal. But for us, like when the homes got flooded with water, it took a lot more to replace those homes because of our drywall and insulation and all that stuff. So anyways, showed up a little late. But they were really impressed that I even came. The one lady I talked, and it pretty much became like all the English teachers in that town were just told, quit everything, just spend the day with this guy. Because they said I was the first foreigner that had ever been to this village. And so they actually had to shut down the school one day because all the kids saw me out of a school window, and they like ran out of the building and started chasing me through the streets and stuff. It was pretty interesting. I was signing autographs to all
You're
of
a celebrity.
them. Yeah, it really was. And so one of them said, "Hey, since you're here on your vacation, we don't want you to have to spend all your time with this village. We want you to see like some of the greater parts of like our local area. So we're going to send you across this little river or across the bay. And someone there, which he speaks a lot better English than I do, one of my friends from college, he'll meet you. He's an English teacher as well, and he'll help show you to this mountain that we have in our province. It was Fujian province. So I was like, okay, cool. And that guy, first thing he said to me when I got off the bus was, "Hey, are you Christian?" And I'm like, "I am." And he instantly threw his arm around. I was like, "Brother, so am I." So he went and took me to all these different, like, instantly was like, let's go visit this brother. Let's go visit this brother. Let's go visit this sister. And it was really cool. And they instantly that night had me preach. But needless to say, like a few months after that, he asked me to come down and preach at like a graduation thing. It was for their high school kids. They had them do like a week-long youth gathering. And this youth gathering was not like our gatherings. They were literally locked up in the church for an entire week. And it was an entire week of Bible study and prayer. It was I didn't see anything fun, like quote fun happening. There wasn't a pizza party and the Coke and the ping pong and all this crazy stuff happening. It was just like, you're going to study God's word before we send you into like college where you're probably going to be eaten alive by like the communist government, So it was like prepping them basically. So he had me come and speak, and that's where I shared this Liang, Shanbo, Yingtai connection. And
you found that the people in the Bible study, they knew this story.
They knew it, definitely. And
had they ever, being Christians themselves, had they ever made that connection?
They hadn't. They hadn't made the connection, and then sharing the Romeo and Juliet thing was pretty cool to them too.
And they had they ever heard the story of Romeo and Juliet?
I think a lot of them had, because they're having to. Some of them now, I think, are having to kind of be familiar with that stuff.
Okay.
I'm trying to see if I actually have. Yeah, here's a quote. I was just looking through the paper, see if I could find it. So sharing this, I close by encouraging them to live every day jumping into the tomb of Jesus to find life until they finally die and are united with him forever. And that's part of the story with the Liang Shanbo Yingtai. Liang Shanbo dies. Yingtai basically dies, jumps into his tomb to die with him. And then two butterflies emerge out of their tomb. Anyways, his reply to this: the response to this message I received from the group leader in the email below reads as follows. Although you might not teach a lot of words, they were all very persuasive with the richness of the Spirit. Some students reviewed what you had delivered to them this afternoon when they told their most impressive verses or revelation they have got during the past few days. From their tones and words, I can tell they were really touched by your words of truth. I have to emphasize that it is not the fact that you are from USA touches them, but your words of God. I think what you said will turn out to be very useful for them. So that was just kind of a response I got back. And so from there, that sort of gave me the seal of approval that if Christians connected with it and liked it, maybe non-Christians would enjoy this as well, especially just the element that you got this foreigner knowing their story. Right.
And I think an interesting follow-up to that is you go on from there to say that the next time you spoke to the same group, right? And they said this time that you didn't need to teach using metaphors, but they wanted you to teach straight from the Bible.
Yeah.
Because now you had you'd opened the door through this common ground, and now they were ready to see.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this time a lot of it was more, you're speaking to Christians, just get to the word. And I think that was really their approach, which I really appreciated hearing that from the Chinese, because I think so often in America you get this idea of preachers like, you have to open with a story and you have to then connect that story to the Bible. And it's like, really? Is that, or can we just get to the Bible? So I think that part was them actually just being more like, just preach the word.
Right.
Which I found very refreshing actually from the Chinese Christians. They highly value God's word. They know what it is, because they probably it was illegal long enough in their country to even have that they're kind of like, we don't need the metaphors.
So what experiences did you have using this story with Chinese non-Christians?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the paper I mentioned this. At this time of my life, for whatever reason, I kind of bought into the concept of, quote, friendship evangelism, meaning like you just befriend people. You don't want to come across as like my sole goal is just to convert you. I need to just love you because I love you. So I actually felt like sometimes I didn't share the gospel as much as I could have because I was more waiting for them to ask. So I didn't use this quite as often as maybe I could have or should have while in China. But at least some of the times I used it the most was with the translators I had, because I had to give surveys in Chinese, and I hired some of my students to be the English translators, and they were asking kind of like, what's the purpose of this survey? And I was explaining it to them. And at least one of them, I think, got pretty touched by it and told me later, like kind of more in private, like, I think what you're doing is good. And I think you're on the right path. This works. And I know he wasn't Christian, so yeah.
Great. Do you want to take a break and then we can come back and talk about
sure.
How this applies to the evangelism that we find ourselves doing on a day-to-day here back in the States, in the culture that we live in, and just why do we think that there is like this value in using stories or finding a common ground in order to get to the gospel?
Yeah, absolutely. That's it.
Many different people have many different opinions about the person and work of Jesus Christ. Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, believe Jesus is our spirit brother, along with Lucifer. Jehovah's Witnesses believe Jesus is actually Michael the Archangel. Muslims believe Jesus was the precursor prophet to Muhammad. Scientologists believe that Jesus was a tool for mind corruption. But what should you believe about Jesus? Better yet, how do you talk about him among these other views? Robot Jesus and Three Other Jesuses You Never Knew is a book authored by me, Kyle Bashirs, that explores how Jesus is viewed within Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, Islam, and Scientology for the purpose of aiding fruitful dialogue about the gospel. It's available now on Amazon in paperback and Kindle editions. Check out dearephesus.org for a free chapter. That's dearephesus.org, and just click on the resource tab. There are many different Jesuses in the world. Are you prepared to give an account for the Savior Jesus?
To financially support Reconnect, visit contradictmovement.org and order your copy of Contradict, They Can't All Be True. Contradict stickers and tracts are also available. Again, that's contradictmovement.org.
All right, so to jump back into this conversation about using story as a way of presenting the gospel, I thought it'd be interesting to turn over to Acts chapter 17. And here, this is where Paul gives his address and starts with, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Now what you worship as something unknown, I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, the Lord of heavens and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands, and he is not served by human hands. And if he needed anything, because he himself, and he is not served by human hands, as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else." And so I think this is this passage from Paul gets cited a lot as a great example of how do you take a common element, how do you point to something in a culture and say, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about here, but let me show you how this actually points back to God. And I think this is exactly kind of the theme of your paper and what you're driving at.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually mentioned Acts 17 in the literary review. The paper was plotted out where you had to first explain the research question and then 2, do a literature review, like what has already been done in this realm, before getting into my methodology. Because ours was really a research question where it wasn't as much a thesis as it was create a question, and then it needed to be something almost that like you needed to be on ground to try to figure out in China. Mm-hmm. And so part of my literature review, I found, it's actually your pastor right now, Mike Geary, at E.B. Free Fullerton. He wrote a book called The Jesus of Suburbia, and he mentions this passage and says that with Paul, he was into basically observing the culture and then engaging the culture and then redeeming the culture. And so like you said, like taking where he was at and using that to point to Christ. Erie wrote in that book, if he was speaking to Jews, he quoted the Old Testament. If he was speaking to the Greeks, he quoted their philosophers. Paul engaged them on their terms. He used truth wherever he found it to argue for the gospel of Jesus.
Right. So it's the idea of, I'm not going to ignore this part of your culture. I'm not going to try to shy away from it. No, I'm going to fully embrace it. Like I'm going to, to use a cliche, I'm going to meet you where you're at right here. And I'm going to talk to you using the language that you speak and the terms and the metaphors and the stories that are known to you. And I think that does 2 things. Like it not only opens the doors, but as something that you were getting at earlier, it's just straight up a sign of respect. Like I have taken the time to learn these things myself, familiarize myself with them as a way to understand you and who you are and the things that you hold. And I think like I've seen this before, specifically with you, when we're out at UCI and people walk by and you start speaking to them in their language, right? Like I think we had this happen one time where like you actually, one of the cities that you lived in China, were the students from there, or they like knew where it was, or that was like something that you had in common.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
Like sitting back and just watching that, like I could literally see like them just open up, like, oh, you're not just some random white guy standing out here with by a table with coffee. Like we actually have something in common. And it was like literally I could just see them like open up, like from having like this skeptical, like, who are you? Like, why are you out here, to like, oh my gosh, we have all this in common already.
Yeah.
So I think that's such an effective way to just open the conversation.
Yeah. And it's so basic. Like that's not even knowing their culture. It's just having lived in their city.
Right.
Which is like, I know for me, like I always, if you've always lived in the same city or the same state, you may not relate to it as much. But like, I know for me, like, if I meet anyone from Tennessee, after having lived in, like, if I'm in California, I meet someone from Tennessee, it's kind of like, okay, where from in Tennessee? You know, and if it's like, if they're remotely close, it's like, oh, that's cool. Like, so wow, that's cool. I probably played against you in a football game at one point, and I didn't know it. And here we are talking now in California. And so the same type of thing, like, just if you're a foreigner in a foreign land, like if you meet someone that's actually been to your country, sometimes it's like you just have an instant sort of connection. And then if it's the same, like I think I remember the instance you're talking about. There's probably like 3. I think there were 3 Chinese students at the time, and they were, and I think they were walking by our table, and I just knew they were speaking Chinese. And that this was when we were offering coffee. So instead of saying, do you want coffee in English, I would ask them in Chinese, do you want coffee? And then I told them, like, well, we got like milk and sugar with it, and they're like, oh, okay. So yeah, pretty cool stuff. Just the way we can make connections over the most minimal stuff that can just help in the gospel presentation. Yeah.
And kind of on a similar train of thought, we've talked about this on previous show with Adam Stetson, kind of how we would do evangelism on college campus using this exact tactic that you've described now in this show, of having a table out, having the contradict sign out. And kind of one of the devices that I found helpful, it was not exactly, I wouldn't exactly call it a story, but there were points in the conversation where like I could refer exactly to what we were doing by offering people free coffee as kind of a way to enter into a conversation about the gospel. that is, I could explain to somebody, like, we are out here, we've purchased the coffee for you, we're offering it to you freely, we're not going to accept any money from you for the coffee, it's not for sale, there's nothing you can do to earn this coffee, you can't buy it from us. Whether or not you take it or leave it doesn't change the fact that we've come out here with the coffee and are offering it to you. And, that's kind of the same way that God is operating in this system of, like, grace is given to you freely. You can choose to reject it, but it doesn't change what God has done for you already through Jesus Christ on the cross. And of course, not that I'm at all saying that, what we're doing is a perfect metaphor for that, but, like, people, I think the times that I would use that, I think it really connected with people in the sense of, like, yeah, I guess that does make sense. That what I choose to believe about it doesn't change reality. Like, just because I walk by you and choose to ignore your free coffee doesn't change the fact of what you've already done.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that I found that to be, like, a very useful device to kind of enter into that, like, conversation about, like, well, this is kind of the way the gospel is.
Yeah, definitely. And this isn't, like, story based, but that same episode that you mentioned with Adam, we also mentioned Pastor Mark Jeza. When I heard him share, I heard it via someone else relaying this, but apparently he was on a campus talking to someone, and it was this idea, like what you were saying. Well, Christ has already died for you, and it's done. So if you take it or not, it's already happened. It's already been given for you. He mentioned, oh, well, Jesus has paid for all your sins. The guy goes, well, I don't need that. And Jeza goes, oh, too late. Like, oh, too late. Already did it.
Yeah.
And it's just, like, really, really cool concept. Like, this has already been done.
Yeah. So maybe kind of the last theme that I really want to hit on or make sure we address is, how there's still this gap between we're using a story or we're using a metaphor or, we're using something from the culture or a movie reference or whatever, the conversation that you might find yourself in. You're using these things kind of as a device to get to the truth of the gospel. But there's this gap there of, like, there's the truth of the gospel and then there's this metaphor that you're using or this story. And so how do you bridge that gap? Because I think if I were to think of this, like, as a skeptic, I could easily say, like, oh, that's fine. Romeo and Juliet, that's a nice story. And I believe it is a nice story. And I see the themes that it's painting about, human love and all of that. But, I don't for a moment believe that Romeo and Juliet were actual human beings. And I don't for a moment believe that this story actually happened. So why should I then believe that the story you're telling me about Jesus, why should I believe that that's any more factual than the story about Romeo and Juliet? So how would you go about kind of bridging the gap between those two? Yeah.
Well, from the way you just presented it, they're coming from history as the problem. Like, just because there's parallels with these stories doesn't mean Jesus is a historical person. Just because I don't, like you were saying. So, I mean, if the problem's history, then you would need to address Jesus being a historical figure.
Right.
But it kind of would vary from person to person at this point. Like, the story is like a starting point to share the gospel message or whatever, even if it's the coffee is just an opportunity, Right. But at that point, I think we need to address individual people's concerns or objections because everyone may not have the same objection. And just like the story element, I think, again, on this one, it could be, if all cultures have a similar story, why do all cultures, different languages, different points in history, why are we all basically saying the same thing?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what does that point at?
Yeah.
What is the root of that? Why is that? Why does this seem to be inside of all of us, across cultures, across languages, across time spans? Like, why is that? Like, doesn't that kind of just make you scratch your head a little bit?
If it's unconscious, why would we all unconsciously be thinking the same thing? Does it point to a higher reality? And could we know what that higher reality is? And just see what they say. And if they say, I don't think that higher reality is knowable, I'd be like, why?
Yeah.
Why is it not knowable? Or could this higher reality somehow actually be personable and be able to reveal himself directly to us? No. Well, how do you claim to know that?
Right.
You know, if it's a higher reality beyond us that we can't attain, how do you then be able to have the authority to speak on its behalf that it can't reveal itself to us? You know, and these are things that, again, it's that they are living in like an inconsistent worldview if they are living in that realm that this is unknowable, but I know enough about it to be able to speak for it.
Right.
And just walking people through that, just asking those questions, I think could reveal the inconsistency in their thinking. Or if they don't have inconsistency and they actually say, yeah, that higher reality could reveal itself. And I go, well, do you know if it has? Do you think it's possible that it has?
Yeah.
And at this point, I'm speaking of it. But if they literally sit there and say, I think it's possible, I go, well, back to Jesus.
Yeah.
Could he be who he said he was? Romeo and Juliet weren't making any claims to divinity.
Right.
And again, on this one, I haven't really shared how those stories connect to the gospel, but the idea is these are two parties which, because of their affiliation with their families, cannot be together though they want to be. And the only way they can be united is in death. Both people giving their all, denying who they are. So like, what's in a name? You know, I give you all myself, you give me all yourself. We exchange our names, we get rid of them, and we just give each other fully of ourselves, and then we can be united. And ultimately, it had to be through giving of their lives. But somehow, both stories have this. The Liang, Shanbo, Yingtai has the same scenario, and both parties dying in order to be united. And both sides have this idea that they're together for eternity. I know it's the way it's shared in the song "Don't Fear the Reaper" by Blue Oyster Cult. A very bad song, I realized when I grew up. It's two people. It's a guy basically saying, "Come with me. We'll be like Romeo and Juliet together for eternity. 1,000-something people every day." It's like basically saying, "Come commit suicide with me." Unless he's actually talking beyond that to, let's give fully of ourselves. I'll die for you. You'll die for me. And through this giving of each other, that way we'll be together forever, which is what Christ did. He gave his life for us. In return, what does he say for us? Well, give me all of yourself. Give me all of your sinfulness. You'll get all of my righteousness. Deny yourself, and you can have life forever. He who saves his life will lose it, but if you lose your life for my sake, then you'll gain it. So that was a long answer.
No, I think that's exactly like the pivot that happens eventually in the conversation is, you know, we're both on this common ground of like seeing this story. But what if I were to tell you that I believe that there's actually like, that this story actually points to something that actually did happen and is like, it actually affects you. And I believe actually affects you on an eternal level. Now, wouldn't you want to hear more about that? And I think that's kind of the pivot that needs to happen, that it doesn't just stop at here's a nice story and it mirrors this other story, but here's a story that really gets at our human condition. And it points to the good news of the gospel. And I think it's also worth noting like how, you know, we started the second half of the show with Paul's address to the Athenians, and it's worth noting like how that ends. Because it's very, you know, at the end of Acts chapter 17, it says, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. Yeah. And so it wasn't necessarily this immediate, like, they gave their lives to Jesus because of the strength of Paul's oratory or how he was able to connect the dots between, you know, things in their culture and the resurrection of Jesus, but they at least, you know, their hearts were maybe softened a little bit, or their eyes were opened a little bit more, and they wanted to hear, like, okay, well, I see where you're going with this, but let's spend some more time here. And I think that's really like the strength of this approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you just said's even, I think, it matches something from a podcast I was listening to this morning. It was a podcast called Stand for the Truth. But the guy on there was saying when it comes to evangelism, we need to remember we're not all going to reap a harvest.
Yeah.
And he was referencing 1 Corinthians chapter 3. I have it in front of me, so I'll go and read it. He was saying, and what after all is Apollos and what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The man who plants and the man who waters have one purpose, and each one will be rewarded according to his own labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. So I just think it's kind of cool, like matching that with what you just read from Acts 17. Those people that sneered, that even was a seed planting.
Sure.
Someone else down the line could water that.
Yep.
And someone else could actually be the one to see the conversion.
Mm-hmm.
But God gets the credit through all the step of the process.
Yeah.
So I think that's just helpful to not be discouraged. You know, like we may just be throwing seeds our entire life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think what we're saying here, though, is at least that, what you found and what we've seen, out having conversations on college campuses is this way of using the story as a device, or at least making some sort of connection to somebody on in their personal life, whether that's through speaking their language or finding something that we have in common with them, or showing like we've done our homework, or we know about this, or we know this fact from your religion, or we know what you believe over here.
Mm-hmm.
That these can all be very effective ways of at least planting the seed.
Yeah. And even then, like, contradict is playing on coexist.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, we're showing we know the culture and we know what people are into.
Yeah.
And we're still using that even in a way as a starting point to build to contradict. Because we like to tell people, we're for true tolerance. We would love to be able to live together in peace and harmony. But what does that mean about truth?
Yeah.
Really fun stuff.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks for sharing your experience that you had and kind of how your process of going about finding this and sharing it with me and sharing it with the listener. And hopefully it'll encourage us all to, find those ways to connect with the people that we're talking to and to find that common ground, all for the purpose of getting to the gospel and presenting the gospel with them. Yeah,
absolutely. And listeners, this is episode 34. So if you go to Andy Rasman, which is Andy, WRASMAN.com, and you can go to the Reconnect podcast category, or just search Reconnect in the search box. But if you're looking at pretty currently to when this is released, you'll probably see it on the front page anyways. But I'll provide a link to the paper that George is asking me questions about. I'll provide a link to the Contradict Evangelism episode, which we referenced with Adam, and which Adam was a guest on that. So, and then we also mentioned Mark Jason on that one. So you can check that out, and any other links that come to my mind, I'll throw them on there too. All right, and just remember that it is through Jesus Christ alone that we are reconnected into a right relationship with the Lord.
Your mission, if you choose to accept it, share this episode on all of your social media sites and with your email contacts, people who will benefit from listening to the show. Thank you for listening. Reconnect us, O Lord.